and so you need a different blend in order to meet the air quality requirements. So there's two peaks that you can see in this graph, sort of an early summer peak. Usually they say around Memorial Day, end of May, and then Labor Day, end of summer. And that generally corresponds with the changeover from the winter blend to the summer, and then from the summer blend to the winter. Yes?
If you were to extend the line from December, oh, I'm sorry. If you were to extend the line, the graph from December to January, that might be a third peak because of that increase if you look between January pricing and December pricing. What do you think might cause that third peak?
Oh, well, there's year-to-year trends, so I'm not going to. There's sort of these are sort of there are trends changing from year to year, and there's lots of other factors that go into pricing. But I just wanted to point out those two peaks because that does seem to be a pattern. I'm going to show you a couple different years, and you'll see the variation. Actually, this is 2001. This is 2002. So here you sort of saw a run-up in the early spring, but then it sort of seemed flat through most of the year. In 2003, which is last year, we had, quote-unquote, a bad year in terms of gas price, where it ran up relatively early. It peaked. This was around the time that we were going into Iraq. There's sort of crude oil effects in there. And then there was a fall peak, and that was particularly bad in September, October, for various other reasons last year. And there was a lot of attention last year, particularly in the West Coast. And then this year, you're seeing something like this, an earlier peaking, or earlier rises in gas prices. March, what are we in? April, May now, even before Memorial Day, even before the full changeover. And so that suggests to me that it's really not the winter blend, the summer blend changeover that's causing the run-up in prices at the retail level, that there's more to that that's going on. And a lot of that has to do with the international issues and crude oil prices, and it's really a layering of different factors that affect the prices. But what you're generally seeing is this sort of pattern, and it's sort of this pattern of from the data of the pricing, what you go out, you drive, and you see at the gas stations, from what the news picks up, from what the politicians see. And that's the general story, is that West Coast retail prices are higher than the rest of the U.S., the continental U.S. And so people constantly ask, well, why is that the case? There's a number of reasons. I'm trying to boil this down for you. Supply and demand side reasons. And on the supply side, there's basically a number of bottlenecks in the system that produce gasoline and ultimately bring it to the consumer. There's very few refineries. Refineries are hard to build and hard to expand on. There's a number of reasons for that, but basically that's one of the bottlenecks in the system, is refining the crude oil into gasoline, into a product that meets air quality standards and provides the product that the consumers purchase. When you have few refineries, and the question is locally, do you augment that by importing gasoline from other places, other states? And so anytime you're importing, then you're adding costs because of the transportation and related costs. Yes?
Aren't there the refineries right there in Martinez, though, in that area?
Yes.
But yet the Bay Area gas prices are some of the higher ones that you find. Is
right.
that just a cost of living price and not so much of a distribution or production?
Well, it's not so much the location of the refineries, I'm saying, as much as it's the fact that there's few refineries. That it's basically, there's a limited number of refineries, there's a limited amount of capacity that those refineries can produce, even if they're close by. So if you're limited locally, then you have the option of importing from distance, and then that's where the distance issue comes into play. So we have sort of this bottleneck of refineries, few refineries, and then you have the importing, which can add to the price and take time, which causes disruptions in the system. And then there's this issue of reliability of the existing refineries. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. As I mentioned, in the Bay Area, there's a number of refineries. There's basically 5 refineries in the Bay Area, as you say, in Martinez, Richmond, Hercules, along the waterfront. They've been there for a long time, and that's sort of been the historical trend. Actually, the trend in California is for there to be fewer refineries. The companies that operate the refineries are actually closing down refineries historically, and so if you looked at the number of refineries, you'd see a trend line going downwards. The refineries are getting older, they're sort of wearing out their equipment, and there's a series of planned and unplanned shutdowns. Some people get a little suspicious about the unplanned shutdowns, but certainly if you have any old equipment, there's going to be problems, and it's hard to say what exactly the reasons are all the time for the shutdowns. In terms of pipeline capacity, there's only so many pipelines, and that's also an aged infrastructure system. There are breaks in pipelines, and there are problems with pipelines, and that can also disrupt the supply and the distribution. So whenever you have a problem with refinery breakdowns or shutdowns, or you have a pipeline shutdown or problem, what you're left with is a couple of options, which is shipping again from out of the region. And so estimates are that anytime you do tanker shipping, you're adding another 8 or 12 cents. Anytime you do pipeline shipping, say from West Texas through Arizona, through Southern California, up to Northern California, up to Oregon, you're adding to time and cost through the shipping of that. During these problem periods, you have basically a very tight market, a mismatch between supply and demand, because supply is getting tightened, but demand doesn't necessarily change in response to that. And so the sellers have market power, and basically prices go up, and then they stay up for a while, and the question is just sort of what the effects are of that. Question?
Are there actually pipelines from Texas to California and Oregon?
Yeah, there's a very, what I would say is a very thin system of pipelines, and there are basically it's a problem in the sense that it costs a lot of money to make investments in pipelines, so we're basically left with the system of thin pipelines, thin in the sense of few pipelines that we have. Last fall, just for example, there was a break in a pipeline between Arizona and New Mexico and Texas. It was a major break. The oil, the gasoline that was being distributed from West Texas into Arizona was disrupted. Gasoline prices in Phoenix went up just above $2. Phoenix, which is a very auto-dependent metropolitan area, had major disruptions. What happened was prices went up in Phoenix and in Arizona. The pipelines that provided distribution between California and Arizona were then shipping gasoline from Southern California to Arizona in response to the high prices. So then Southern California was affected. The prices went up there. Some of the gasoline that could be transported by tanker or by pipeline down to Southern California from Northern California then went that way. Prices in Northern California went up. So there's a ripple effect geographically whenever there's a major break in the system. And because we're all sort of connected and there's only so much supply to go around, we all sort of feel a little ripple, especially on the West Coast where we're connected. In addition to the supply side issues, there are these demand side issues, which are, I think, you can think of being as independent, but very much an impact on this. Increasing population, increasing rates of auto ownership, increasing rates of auto use, more miles being driven, increased overall demand. That's a secular trend that's just going upwards consistently over the decades this century. Automobile sales and purchase patterns, I mean the type of automobiles that are being sold and bought. In the last couple of decades, particularly the 90s, have resulted in a less fuel-efficient fleet than might theoretically be possible. And then we have because of our patterns of living, our urban form, and our patterns of transportation, we have a reliance upon the automobile for travel, and what that results in economically is inelastic demand for gasoline. When you see price volatility, you see these price spikes, which basically look like shark fins. Basically, you have a steep runoff and then you have a slow drop-off. What that reflects is, I think it reflects a basic sort of unreliability of the supply system. The price is a signal to the consumer about a relative shortage of gasoline. And so an unplanned shutdown, as I said, reduce the supply, and then you get a price spike. So that's basically what's going on there. It's really a hard nut to crack. It's a difficult thing. There's no easy solutions, I think. But the basic themes, I think, of what policy-wise can be done are basically West Coast states should increase the reliability of the supply system, and West Coast states should increase the elasticity of demand for retail gasoline, basically to try to do something on either side of the equation. Some people sort of will basically say, well, prices go up, prices go down. That's the way the private market works, so why worry about it? Prices reflect what's going on in the marketplace in the free enterprise system. Well, the basic reasons, and this is a little bit of repeating, for government to get involved is when you have a market failure, and that justifies the remedies. And so there's basically these two, as I see it, two basic market failures. There's the externalities, the environmental impacts that are not fully taken into account. Those are real impacts and costs to society. There are also some safety costs, and I'm not sure that we're fully incorporating those externality costs to society. And then there's market power issues. The extreme of that is if you had a monopoly situation. And so whenever there's a monopoly situation, we go back to things like Teddy Roosevelt and antitrust policies, which are part of the justification for government to be involved. In terms of externalities, we talked a little bit about air pollution. There's this new set of issues around greenhouse gas and climate change. A new National Academy of Science study estimates that the externality cost of the greenhouse gas emissions is about 7 to 24 cents. Those probably aren't in the price right now. There are other environmental externalities upstream and downstream from the actual combustion in the vehicle. If you have oil tanker spills, how do you incorporate that into the cost to society? Energy supply security in terms of the international geopolitical system. That $87 billion was, the number basically that's earlier last year that was that the president asked Congress to appropriate for continued military operations in Iraq. So there's a question, there's debate about it, about how much of that is really should be incorporated into the costs that that society is paying to provide for this energy supply. A couple of economists have estimated an additional externality tax. There's different numbers floating around about that, but I think basically there's still externalities that aren't internalized, as the economists would say. The other market failure is about market power. Clearly in the international crude oil market, there's market power. This is something from the National Academy of Sciences. Is this about the last question? Yeah. Go ahead. Question. Yep.
Is an externality tax something that Europe uses and might be part of why their gas is more expensive than ours? Like, don't they have a lot higher taxes on their gasoline than we do?
Yeah, the Europeans and Japan, other countries do have higher taxes on gasoline. I'm not sure policy-wise whether those are, whether you can say that those are externality taxes. My sense is that some portion of those taxes are used for government operations. Economically, the way an externality tax goes is that basically you tax in order to incorporate the full social cost. I think economically, in theory, what you would do with that revenue is to mitigate the externality impacts, like you would pay for environmental mitigation with that revenue. So I'm not sure the answer, because I think a lot of that tax in other countries goes to government operations. The model that we've chosen, for whatever reasons, in the United States is basically an environmental model with regulation rather than with tax. So what we do at the state and federal level is we regulate air standards, most obviously, to meet a certain health standard, and then the price goes up in order to meet those air standards rather than through an explicit tax. Okay, so in terms of market power then. So this is the National Academy of Sciences talking about OPEC. Basically, the quote is, you know, escalating oil prices above the free market level. So that's market power. There are real economic impacts of that, and that's what the NAS study is talking about there. Some people state these things more strongly than others. Basically, here, you know, here's one quote about monopoly power and talking about the disproportionate sort of concentration of oil reserves within OPEC member countries, and particularly within the Middle East. And so the short of it, though, is that there is, it's a club. There's a few set of countries that have the largest set of oil reserves, and so there's market power in the international crude oil market. There's some debate, there's some discussion about whether there's market power at other points in the distribution chain in terms of actual oil refining. You might look at a particular local region and ask the question about whether there's market power because there's only a certain number of refineries. So there's other market power issues in here. I'm going to try to skip over a little bit of this just to try to get to the remedies. Basically, though, if you look at economics and you look at sort of monopoly or cartel systems, what's here is, I think, pretty straightforward logic. Basically, there's three factors that affect the power that a cartel or that a monopoly has. The larger the market share, the more the market power. The amount of supply elasticity, in other words, if the price goes up, how quickly can supply increase? And then the amount of demand elasticity, if the price goes up, how much can demand decrease? Those are the three factors that affect the amount of market power you have. So there's three ways to reduce dependency when there is a cartel system. You can diversify supply away from the cartel, so you might want to increase production from non-cartel sources. And you can increase supply elasticity or price responsiveness. And what I'm saying here is that basically at a state level or a local level, you can't really do much about oil supply. Crude oil supply isn't really affected by what any of us in one state are doing. Federal policy, on the other hand, can affect that more significantly. State level and sub-state level local actions can have some impact on supply elasticity, I think, in terms of the distribution system, as I was talking about, reliability of the supply distribution system. But finally, and I think most significantly, where the local and regional and state impacts can be the most important is in terms of demand elasticity. Basically, you as an individual or you as a city or you as a county, where you have the most impact is you're a price taker. So basically, all you can affect most significantly is your demand, your response to the price. Recently at our AAA of Northern California, Nevada, and Utah, we looked at some of these issues. We brought them to our board, and we came up with a couple of policies. I'm going to just run quickly through them. Basically, there's three general principles. The principle of a reliable supply system for transportation energy. Basically, there's no getting around. You're going to transport yourself. We're going to travel. You have to have some reliable energy supply. The principle of increasing fuel efficiency. This is pretty common sense. And then the principle of increasing alternative energy sources. And so these are reasonable principles, we hope and we think, that should guide a lot of policies and actions. Let me try to run through this. But basically what this sort of lays out is consistent with that analysis of market power. Basically, in terms of demand, we're for promoting consumer choice for vehicles, particularly more choices in the marketplace that have more fuel-efficient vehicles to choose from. And that's sort of where AAA of Northern California is coming from. I think a lot of other AAAs would agree with that. If you have more choices, the consumer is more likely to choose the more fuel-efficient vehicles. In addition to that, to reduce your or to increase your elasticity, if you have travel choices other than the automobile, during times of high prices, you can choose to carpool, you can choose to ride share or take public transportation. Yeah, question?
Yeah, I know in the beginning you said, really made that really clear that this is your AAA and it's not all AAA.
Right, right. Yep.
And it's really nice set of principles. And I'm kind of curious if other AAAs have taken those principles on, and also like when things like Senate bills in the U.S. Senate are being considered in terms of fuel efficiency standards and stuff, if AAA of America has taken on those types of principles and those types of discussions.
Well, the way the Federation is organized is they're all separate organizations with their own separate boards and separate, the members, reflect the geography, and there's differences in different parts of the country. So that's why I can't speak for, other than the organization that I work for in terms of the policies. But I think in general, the AAA Federation members see themselves as advocates for the consumer. And so some of these things, I think, would be pretty consistent. But it's going to vary. I mean, it's a big country, and there's lots of variation around the country. I'm going to talk about one policy, though, that might be of interest to you if I have time to get to the end. Yep.
Question about this.
Yeah.
This slide. I'm reading the second one. It says a wider range of fuel-efficient vehicles give consumers more choices. Is that sort of getting at the idea that the fuel-efficient vehicles available now are not particularly appealing to consumers, and that we're looking for maybe an increase in, or improvements in technology to allow the more desirable vehicles to be fuel-efficient?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot that's underneath this. This is meant to be a very simple summary statement. Basically, I think the story has been that the public thinks, because of the last, 4 decades since the oil shocks of the 70s, the public thinks that more fuel-efficient vehicles means smaller vehicles. So there's sort of this trade-off that people often feel that, well, I can't have a fuel-efficient vehicle because that means I'll get a smaller car, it'll be less safe, I'll have less room for my family, won't have the power, and so forth and so forth. But if you look at the technology that's available, if you look at the scientific research and the analysis that's done by places like the National Academy reports, there is off-the-shelf technology for greater fuel efficiency in the design and components of vehicles. So it doesn't have to be the case that more fuel efficiency equals smaller vehicles. There's lightweight materials, there's aerodynamics and design of vehicles, there's a number of issues that I'm not an expert in terms of the whole energy supply and distribution system within the vehicle, how efficient that is. An example of that, very clearly that's starting to show up in the marketplace is hybrid vehicles. So if you have the gasoline electric hybrids, you get more mileage for the same car. And then it's just a question of the cost for that technology. Does that answer your question? Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about. Yeah. I'm going to run through a couple of other things here, and then I'll try to get to policies, okay? Recently, there have been 4 or 5 different policy issues that we've been dealing with. These are pretty current issues. And they sort of represent, I think, some of the cutting-edge questions in terms of policy related to this question of gasoline prices and fuel efficiency. In terms of CAFÉ, are you all familiar with CAFÉ, this corporate average fuel economy regulation? Basically, this goes back to the 70s when we had the oil shocks of the 70s, and Congress passed a law that required the fleet of vehicles produced by manufacturers to meet certain standards. And there's various calculations for how they do this. But basically, there's a passenger car standard, and then there's a light truck standard. It's sort of, two average fuel efficiency set of numbers, something like 22 right now and 25 or something. I don't know the exact figures offhand. So basically, this is in federal law, and it's a regulation, and the manufacturers have to comply. Our statement related to this was that there should be policies that promote fuel efficiency, and that they should be periodically reviewed. And CAFÉ is one of those that should be periodically reviewed. So what's happened recently, those of you who might be following some of the stuff in Washington, is there's been a couple of different tries at an energy bill. The administration and the Congress have been trying to move forward an energy bill which has a number of different energy-related issues, not just transportation energy, but there's actually a lot of stuff related to electrical energy restructuring, which might be good stuff. But what you hear about is a lot of the controversial issues related to energy supplies, such as drilling in Alaska and so forth. But one of the proposals under that bill was to take a new look at CAFÉ. And basically, they couldn't get any agreement on it, so that's not really in the proposal. It's been decades since the CAFÉ standards have been updated by Congress. So in lieu of that, what's happened, though, that hasn't made it into the news so much is that they're looking at CAFÉ again, not legislatively, but administratively. So in terms of the regulation that the U.S. Department of Transportation puts forward, they're looking at how to structure that regulation. And so we've been looking at that issue and trying to sort of see what we could say that might contribute to the discussion. So basically, there's this proposal out that basically having two sets of numbers for all passenger cars, 22, and for light trucks, 25, that doesn't really make sense. That's basically the situation, is that that doesn't provide the right incentives for more fuel-efficient vehicles to be put into the marketplace. And if you look at the trends of the fleet and what's purchased, that seems to be the case. We did see increasing fuel economy in the fleet through the 70s and then the 80s, but then since that time, fuel economy has dropped off. We actually have a less fuel-efficient fleet than we used to. And so what we take from that is that the current system isn't working, and that CAFÉ could be restructured and should be restructured. So we recently issued some statements and contributed to the public comment with the Department of Transportation, where we basically said, I think, three things. The first thing is that the existing program no longer encourages substantial improvements in fuel efficiency. There are a number of proposals for how you should structure the system to make it work better. So we're not sure exactly which one would work the best, but the current system doesn't seem to provide the right incentives to the manufacturers. This second issue is related. It's like the Hummer issue, basically. There's a number of big vehicles that are exempt because the law was written at a time when people thought that a vehicle over 8,500 pounds couldn't possibly be used for personal use. And, so that was all must have been commercial use. But, times have changed, and, people or roads or something's gotten bigger, so people are buying bigger vehicles. So this proposal would sort of just update that, at least to include some set of the big SUVs into the CAFÉ standards. And then this third issue is about the test procedures for how you measure miles per gallon. That's sort of a technical engineering issue, but that's important for how you set the standard. So this is sort of moving forward, and we'll see what the Department of Transportation comes up with over the course of the next year related to trying to improve the CAFÉ regulation and program. Any questions about that? Yes?
I'm not really familiar with that last one, the CAFÉ standard. So what, the federal tests, are they just like driven on a highway and that's your miles per gallon, or what real world driving driving conditions?
Yeah, that's basically the question, is when you give a vehicle a rating for miles per gallon, and you go to the car dealership, you see the sticker on the vehicle window. It's sort of what's behind that number, what's the test that they actually did to give you that number. And I'm not an expert on this, but there's some debate about what the right set of tests is. Yeah. But I think part of that has to do with how people are driving, basically. 30 years ago, we might have spent less time on the freeways and more time on city streets, while, in many areas these days, the freeways are the local streets. I mean, you can't get from one place to another without getting on the freeway, so that's sort of the part of that issue there. Yeah. Okay. Boutique fuels and the oxygenate requirement. Basically, there's this overlapping set of air regulations because the states are involved and the federal government's involved and so forth. And so some people have proposed that there should basically be one air standard, and then what would happen is that instead of having small markets for different formulas of gasoline throughout the country, you might have a more standard set of formulas, and so that would create better efficiencies in the marketplace of gasoline supply, and then the price would go down. So basically, in that case, in theory, California could get its gasoline from a refinery in any part of the country, and you wouldn't have little mini markets, So that's the argument. I'm not completely sure sort of what the answer is in regards to that, because there's a reason why there's different air regulations in different places. The reason is basically because air pollution is different in different places, I think, and you sort of have this federalist system where different states have their own rules and regulations. So there's sort of a trade-off. In California, it's particularly bad because air pollution is particularly bad. So California has often been in the situation where their air regulations are stronger than the federal air regulations. And so, in order to promote air pollution reduction in California, you might have tougher standards and, different formulas. Maybe you'd want cleaner burning fuel in California more than you'd want it in another area where the air pollution isn't as much of a problem. Gasoline taxes. I figured I have to say something about this. Basically, in our area, AAA is opposed to gasoline tax increases at this point, and it doesn't really have as much to do with gasoline prices as it has to do with what the money is used for and whether the money is going to the right purposes, whether it's being used for transportation or basically whether gasoline taxes are funneled away for non-transportation purposes, which is what's happening in California. This is sort of another sort of policy issue related to, yep, Chris.
In Oregon, it's in the Constitution, you can't use the state. You can't use the gas tax for anything other than highway improvements.
Yeah, but it's actually in our Constitution too in California, but, basically, there's a loan taken out against the Highway Trust Fund in California. So right now it's a question about whether that loan is going to be repaid. The state budget crisis is so bad in California that they sort of look for money however they can get it with the state government. So, yep.
Do you think that AAA supports gas tax money being used on transportation for other things besides solely roads?
I think our policy is basically that the gas tax should be used, the state gas tax should be used for the highway system, and I think the California law is that basically it's for highways and for any what they call fixed guideways, capital transit, not operating transit, but sort of building the rail system or building the tracks for the train system or something like that. But this has certainly, been a dilemma for the AAA. Yes, Rob?
Sort of two questions.
Yeah.
In California, do they use gas tax for the CHP? And then the second one is when these gas price spikes happen, Memorial Day, Labor Day.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you've thought about this maybe almost from a psychological or sociological standpoint. Why is the first thing that people often say, we need to eliminate gas tax? Just kind of wondering.
Because the first answer is no. I don't think that any of our gas tax in California is used for CHP, for highway patrol. But I've heard that this is an issue in Oregon. On the second question, what I've noticed in the political realm is that basically, people will sort of use arguments and then they'll get sort of picked up into the media. And so if it's just sort of the natural thing if you're representing you sort of want to point the finger in the other direction, and so that's what people do. So people point the finger in one direction so that it doesn't affect them, and other people point the finger in the other direction because that's what they get paid to do. Am I being too obtuse? Yeah. But it remains to be seen, as a person hearing all these arguments, what you think the real truth is. You're going to hear people arguing things, and, yeah.
Well, it seems from what you're saying about the causes for gas price spikes that if the gas tax was zero, if there's no such thing as a gas tax, whether it was in Oregon or in California, the spikes would still happen. So that's kind of maybe to answer your question. This is just funny that people think that's a cause or will save them all that much money.
Yeah. When I used to teach, wherever the class is or whatever the discussion is, you just sort of put on your BS meter, and you have to figure out whether one argument, rings the buzzer for you or not. And so that's part of the reason you're here. Yeah.
Is there, when gas taxes go up, let's say it went up 2 cents a gallon, is there some propensity for the gas price to go up by more than 2 cents a gallon when that happens?
I'm sorry, when which goes up?
Let's say we increase gas tax by 2 cents a gallon.
Right.
And then by the time it reaches the consumer and the
Right.
consumer's paying on this, does the actual impact on the prices wind up being more than 2 cents a gallon? It's something that's always kind of confusing.
Well, okay, let me bounce this back to you, okay? Do you remember about market power? Let's say that you have the market power because you're the person giving the price. So then what would you do if gas taxes went up 2 cents?
Well, with an inelastic market, I would try to get the gas prices as much as possible higher. So I might bump it up higher and blame the gas tax.
Would you raise it less than 2 cents?
Definitely not.
So yes, if you go back to economics, right? If there's inelasticity, then you can pass on costs to the consumer, right? That's what a producer can do when it's an inelastic demand, is you can pass on greater proportions of your costs to the consumer. And so, beyond that, it's what the market would bear.
So does that mean 2 cents, or does that mean 3 cents with the 2 cent increase, or like?
Well, I'm not on the inside of sort of the pricing decisions, so I don't really know, what proportions go into it. But, you realize there's market power somewhere throughout the system, and you sort of think about that. Yeah.
Has there been any studies or thoughts about maybe kind of market abuse by gasoline companies a la Enron and Energy?
Yeah. There's been. That's the funny. There's sort of, when you start to look at this, there seems to be the cycle of this. Prices go up. The media picks up the news stories. Some politicians will sort of say, "Hey, we got to look at this." Sometimes they'll get some state or federal agency to look at it. So you've had the Fair Trade Commission, at the U.S. government level look at this. You've had the state attorney general in California look at this. You've had the U.S. Congress's General Accounting Office, which is their investigative arm, look at this. But My sense was that these investigations have basically not resulted in any sort of finding of anything illegal. But so that's sort of the dilemma about it. Is there's no sort of easy answer. Okay. Okay, on to other things. This is the last sort of policy issue, which I think is very interesting. There's this new issue related to greenhouse gas emissions and global warming, climate change. And when I used to work at the EPA, I was actually working on some of these issues. But they're not working on it that much in Washington these days. But in Sacramento, there was a law that was passed to basically say that the Air Resources Board should put forward what would be the first in the nation's regulation related to greenhouse gas emissions. So the argument is that you should treat carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions like other things that are pollutants. Nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide, all those things are regulated by the state and federal air agencies. And so the argument is to say treat carbon dioxide and other global warming gases like that and put an air standard, put a restriction on the amount that you can emit. And so what this would do in effect actually would be to potentially increase fuel efficiency. And the basic reason for that is that carbon dioxide in particular comes out of the tailpipe in proportion to the amount of fuel that's consumed. So if in order to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide coming out of the tailpipe per mile, you basically, the argument is that you result in less fuel being consumed. So this is something that's being developed. It's sort of an interesting first-in-the-country process that they're going through. The last set of information I have on this was that the automakers plan to sue the state as soon as they come up with a regulation. The state sort of knows this, that they're trying to be very careful and thorough in developing these new regulations. And so we're sort of watching this to sort of see what happens. The question, I think one of the big questions is just whether you can do this in a way that's, well, legal, but then also doesn't cause a big cost to the consumer. That's sort of the question in the marketplace. Related to that CAFÉ au lait question, which is how much would you pay for your vehicle or for gasoline? Would you pay more, and how much more, in order to get less global warming or less climate change? How much are you willing to pay for that environmental benefit? Yes?
Did you say that the automakers are planning to sue the legislature?
The state, not the legislature, but the state air board. That's what my understanding is.
On what basis?
Well, if you work with lawyers, you find that there's arguments all the time for whatever argument you want to take. But my sense of it was that there's basically this issue about preemption. If you're interested in law, you'll love this. When the federal government passed the CAFÉ law, I think around that time, there was this idea that basically only the federal government should regulate fuel economy. It's this argument about sort of standardization. So the argument legally is that if California puts forward this regulation related to, quote unquote, climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, what it's doing is it's preempting the federal government's authority to regulate fuel economy. And so in that sense, the state is not following what the federal law should be. So that's sort of the technical legal reasoning. But what that underlies, I think, in reality is sort of this big political fight that's going on between, on a lot of these energy environmental issues, which is basically in this political environment, should the federal government in Washington be sort of setting the ground rules, or should there be more diversity and have the states in particular have variation with their ground rules and their laws? And it sort of reflects, the political layout. If you're an automaker at this point, you might say, well, let's just have one rule and let's just be able to go to Washington and, have the rules be set there. Yes?
Wasn't there a regulation in California that a certain percentage of vehicles sold there had to be zero emission and then a certain percentage low emission? And what happened with that?
Right. There's a, as I understand it, and again, I'm not an expert in this, there's a ZEV mandate, which is a zero emission vehicle mandate. Maybe Jennifer would be able to say more about this. And there's a LEV mandate, those are both in place, I believe. Go ahead, Jennifer.
I don't remember exactly, but they weakened these EV mandates and delayed it, and so it isn't the way it originally was intended. I don't know if what you were getting at. I mean, California is allowed to set separate air quality regulations, emissions regulations on vehicles, but under the CAFÉ, they're not technically allowed to do different fuel efficiency. But the Federal Clean Air Act does allow other states to adopt stricter emission standards for vehicles, and California has done that.
There was also a lawsuit that the automakers filed against the ZEV mandate, and so there was a number of back and forth, I guess, set of negotiations around that. I haven't looked into this issue that much, but there are people who say that the ZEV mandate really hasn't been as successful as the LEV mandate. I think you can probably draw a line between, connect the dots between the LEV mandate and hybrid vehicles, and sort of all this set of low emission vehicles, including hybrids. But it's not as obvious to sort of connect the dots to see what the ZEV mandate led to. I mean, if you wanted to disparage it, you could say, well, it just led to more, electric golf courses and electric golf carts in retirement communities. But I mean, I think that people had a lot more optimism about electric vehicles, for example, zero-emission electric vehicles earlier on, and that hasn't panned out in the marketplace as much as things like hybrid vehicles and even just low-emission vehicles that you see in the marketplace. Yep.
But could the ZEV mandate not be so popular due to a lack of infrastructure? There's not so many places to plug in an electric car, all around, and the distance traveled isn't very high.
Yeah, I think in transportation energy, we sort of have this chicken and egg problem, which seems to be, a real problem between the vehicle and the infrastructure, the energy supply infrastructure. It's been really a dilemma for me as I've looked into this as to why other sectors of the economy have been able to move towards a more diversified set of energy sources. So if you look at industry or if you look at households, residential, they don't rely on petroleum products. It's transportation that relies on petroleum products. And I think the big part of that is that, as you say, you don't have the electrical gas stations, you don't have the natural gas stations, you don't have the, whatever ethanol, gas stations and pipelines and whole, infrastructure. So that's, that's been part of the difficulty of getting there. We'll have the same problem with hydrogen, right? If we go towards hydrogen. Yeah.
I really was interested in the part of your presentation where you talked about all the refining processes and how much per gallon that costs, how many cents per gallon that adds to the cost of gas at the pump.
Yep.
Has there ever been a study where it looked at, like, for every dollar spent on gas, how many cents are spent where, for example, like a 2-cent per gallon gas tax? So if, that would mean for every gallon, I guess a gallon now is like, say, $2. So,
Okay, round numbers.
For one, that means that $1.98 is spent on something else, or the costs of that $2
Right.
gallon of gas.
Yeah.
$1.98 is somewhere else.
Yeah, you can break that down.
Has
yeah.
somebody
yeah.
done that? Because it seems as if all the energy spent on like fighting the gas tax would save the maximum 1% if it's $2 a gallon. 1 or 2% if it was $1 a gallon. Of your costs, there's still your 99 or 98% of your costs are coming from something else. And if there was ever a breakdown, like
Yeah,
you had,
right.
of where all those costs come from,
Right.
and maybe the lobbying and the political energy could be spent in reducing those costs,
Right.
rather than trying to reduce 1% of the costs.
Well, I mean, to be fair, like in California, let's say it's $2 per gallon. Basically, there's about an 18-cent federal and an 18-cent state gas tax. So that's like 36 cents or 36.5 cents, I think, really, it is out of that $2. So it's not insignificant, but you can break down the costs. You can kind of convert from the crude oil costs, for a barrel of crude oil. You can take that part of it, and then you can take the refining costs, and you can take the distribution costs, and so you can sort of try to break it down in there. And I think what you find is that there are so many different layers that any of those layers, whenever there's a problem, then it bumps up the total. We find that they've been torturing prisoners of war in Iraq. That bumps up the crude oil price that feeds into the system that you see, in terms of the end retail gas. That's in addition to all the other refinery and distribution issues I talked about, and yeah.
If you broke it down in like a pie chart, in California the gas tax is 18%, so that'd be 18. No, cents. 18 cents. So that'd be like 10% at $2 a gallon.
18 cents state plus 18 cent federal. So
Per gallon.
36 out of $2. 36 cents out of $2. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
It's $2 a gallon, so the tax for that gallon would be 36 cents.
Yeah, roughly.
Oh.
Yeah, roughly. Yeah.
So that's about 20% of or 18%
yeah,
of the cost of a gallon of gas is to the tax. Is
right.
there what other costs are anywhere near that? Are there a percent of the cost? Or are they all like 3%, 3%, 3%? All the other slices
I think
of the pie
crude
are
oil.
really
I think
small
crude
and
oil.
big chunks?
I think crude oil is the largest part of that. I should have that with me.
There was
but
a
I
pie
don't know.
chart in the Oregonian. And
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Somewhere, pretty easily. But yeah, I broke it down. The crude oil was a huge percentage of it.
Yeah, I mean, but I should say, not to be totally like evasive. So I should say that it's. I mean, what you pointed out earlier is true. The gas tax doesn't change over the course of the year. So if the gas price is changing over the course of the year, it's not the tax that's changing. Yes.
With regards to the lack of infrastructure as far as the pipelines and refineries are concerned, how much of that is a result of market failure? I mean, it seems to me that in a perfectly competitive market, one company's failure to meet the demand would result in another company adding refinery capacity or building new pipelines.
Yeah, I mean, in a more competitive market, I was trying to think of the analogy, the right analogy. That's why sometimes I think about coffee. It's, in theory, as long as you're not too much tied to one brand of coffee, if one company raises their prices, you can go out and get coffee somewhere else, or somebody can set up a coffee stand and start producing it and so forth. But that doesn't happen, with gasoline. And so, that's a reflection of market power and some form of market failure. And it doesn't take, it just sort of takes each individual player to look at its strategic advantage and make its own decisions too. It doesn't necessarily mean that, people are like talking to each other about it. Once you have few players, then you can start to see your strategic advantage, I think.
We have time maybe for one very brief question, or if there's something more you want to finish.
No, I just, again, thanks for inviting me. Is there any other burning questions?
Is there any indication or sense what the events in Iraq, and not recently what you just referred to, but overall what impact that'll have on global supply or market power in maybe the long run? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
OPEC, et cetera.
Yes, I'm getting relaxed here at the end, so I'll just tell you what I think. And again, I'll just say this doesn't reflect anything about what my employer or any of the organizations. I mean, I think this is sort of just from what I read and sort of my take on it. I think that people in the federal government thought this was going to be much easier than it's proven to be. People thought that this would stabilize the political system in the Middle East and also stabilize the energy supply system. But basically, from what I'm told, once we started talking about war, the prices ran up. And then once we got in, basically there's no oil coming out of Iraq. And so the prices, the international crude supply system is arguably less stable than before. And it's not an accident that part of the way that the people in Iraq are trying to work against the military there, what they see as the occupying military there, is by disrupting the pipeline system in Iraq. Is because they see the connection between the oil supply system and the geopolitics of it. And so, I think a lot of people are starting to see this. Even the people who were for it before are seeing this is much harder than it appeared to be, and we're going to be in this for a while, and it's not clear how we get out now that we're in. But maybe y'all can do something about it. So thanks again.
Thank you very much.